John chapter 6, 22 to 40, the Message. The next day, the crowd that was left behind realized that there had been only one boat and that Jesus had not gotten into it with his disciples. They had seen them go off without him. By now, the boats from Tiberias had pulled up near where they had eaten the bread blessed by the Master. So when the crowd realized he was gone and wasn't coming back, they piled into the Tiberias boats and headed for Capernaum, looking for Jesus. When they found him back across the sea, they said, Rabbi, when did you get here? Jesus said, you've come looking for me, not because you saw God in my actions, but because I fed you, filled your stomachs, and for free. Don't waste your energy striving for perishable food like that. Work for the food that sticks with you, for that nourishes your lasting life. Food the Son of Man provides. He and what he does are guaranteed by the God the Father to last. To that they said, well, where do we then get in on God's works? Jesus said, sign on with the one that God has sent. The kind of commitment gets you in on God's works. They waffled, why don't you give us a clue about who you are? Just a hint of what's going on. When we see what's up, we'll commit ourselves. Show us what you can do. Moses fed our ancestors with bread in the desert. It says so in the scriptures. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus responded, the real significance of that scripture is not that Moses gave you bread from heaven, but that my Father is right now offering you bread from heaven, the real bread. The bread of God came down out of heaven and is giving life to the world. They jumped at that. Master, give us this bread now and forever. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. The person who aligns with me hungers no more and thirsts no more, ever. I have told you this explicitly, even though you haven't seen me in action, you don't really believe me. Have seen me in action. Every person the Father gives me eventually comes running to me, and once that person is with me, I hold on and don't let go. I came down from heaven not to follow my own agenda, but to accomplish the will of the one who sent me. This, in a nutshell, is that will. That everything handed over to me by the Father be completed, not a single detail missed, and that the wrap-up of time I have everything and everyone put together, upright and whole. This is what my Father wants, that anyone who sees the Son and trusts who he is and what he does and aligns with him will enter real life, eternal life. My part is to put them on their feet and hold that at the completion of time.
Good morning again, everyone. And again, let me reiterate a very warm welcome. It's so good to have you here for our Easter Sunday service. Really appreciate you taking the time. And just being here this morning to encourage us. It is fantastic. My name is Matt, just in case we don't know each other, and I'm one of the leaders here at Margate Christian Church. So Easter Sunday, we are here primarily to celebrate and to give thanks for Jesus. Jesus, who we believe was both fully human and fully God at the same time. And we're here primarily to celebrate the fact that he rose from the dead and all the good things that that means. But look, claiming that a man rose from the dead is, I'd argue, no small thing. I'd also maintain that believing in God these days is no small thing. And in our context, that is, first world West, believing in God seems to be an increasingly minority position, if you like. So I read recently the social commentator Mary Harrington. She wrote that it is now outright heresy, so like using it like a kind of traditional religious term, heresy, to believe that matter, that is physical material, has any relationship with divinity, that is with God. There is no longer any relationship, any believed-in relationship between things that are physical and the divine. And that to suggest that anyone might be called to any purpose other than the one they themselves have chosen is to be guilty of a kind of moral violence. So if you suggest that anyone might be called to do something with their lives, there's some purpose with their lives other than the one that they have picked for themselves, that is a kind of moral violence. I'm not even sure what moral violence means, but it sounds pretty scary, right? It sounds pretty scary. It sounds like a bad thing. Or you may be familiar with the beloved Aussie songwriter Nick Cave. I think just last week or so he was asked to reflect on both to reflect and to compare. So he was asked to compare the orthodoxies that he rallied against in his early punk years of the 70s and 80s. So back in the 70s and 80s, he was one of those guys who was flying in the face of, I guess you could say, mainstream middle-class sensibilities. He was shocking. He was truly alternative. He was flying in the face of all that and offending people left, right and centre. So this interviewer asked him, now that he's in his 60s, how do those things that you were kind of, I guess, protesting against, pushing back against, the mainstream sensibilities in the 70s and 80s, how do they compare to the ones that you're kind of kicking against now? How do you shock people now? How do you kind of beat punk now in 2023? And he answered, if you want to be punk in 2023, if you want to kind of fly in the face of mainstream sensibilities and good taste, this was his answer. Go to church and be conservative. Things have really changed. Things have really changed. So here in Tasmania and the rest of Australia, if you're a person of faith, it can feel like you're in a small and increasingly smaller club if you go on record for believing this. So this Easter Sunday morning, I want to encourage you, I want to encourage us, I want to encourage all of us. If you believe in God, I want to encourage you to keep the faith, so to speak. If you don't currently believe in God, I want to encourage you to consider it, or at least don't dismiss it out of hand. And the way that I want to encourage you is by examining some of the stereotypes and common stories we hear constantly about why people end up believing or not believing in God. It's just so easy to characterise the choice to believe in God as one of blind faith, and the choice not to believe in God or to stop believing in God as one of rationally following all available evidence. Now, whether you view yourself as a Christian here or not, you probably know people, you've probably got people in your circles who used to believe but now don't. I certainly know those people. I count many of them as my closest friends. And often their journey, if you like, is simplified or reduced to having the courage to think for themselves if they've been brought up in a Christian home. And then they've bravely followed rationality to its logical conclusion, which has led to their faith being dismantled. Now, please hear me. I don't want to take away from the fact that sometimes people do show great courage in leaving behind the faith or the lack of faith that they've kind of inherited and grown up with. And I'd be encouraging people to own whatever they believe and not just take something on secondhand or vicariously. But I don't think that leaving behind faith or belief is as simple as naturally following where science and reason take us. And I certainly don't think that choosing between believing or not believing in God comes down to simply turning your brain on or off. And I think that's really important to talk about, especially on Easter Sunday, as both Christians and non-Christians can so easily, I suppose, fall into believing those stereotypes. It's brain off, it's prejudice on. And again, that may not be you. You may be firmly, if you like, convicted and convinced of your faith, which is great. And you might not question that at all. And you might not think that it's as simple as I'm making it out. But I'd argue if it's not you, it's someone in your circles. If it's not you, it's going to be the person that maybe is at your table over lunch this afternoon. There'll be someone in your circle who again is at risk of giving up faith because they believe it is that hard to maintain. Or there's someone perhaps who's never even considered believing, and the reason they haven't considered believing is they think it's all superstition and it means turning off any critical faculties. So this morning, I'd like you to join me in looking at 4 areas of common human experience that those who believe and those who don't believe both have to grapple with. I want to look at the issue of faith, or active trust, as you can call it. I want to look at the background factors that go into influencing whether we believe something or not. I want to look at the issue of doubts. And I want to look at the big topic of morality and meaning. So here we go, faith. Now, if you consider yourself a Christian, then you'll be familiar with the idea of faith, having an active trust in God, believing and living as if Jesus rose from the dead, for example. Now, somewhat obviously, although there's significantly more historical evidence than you may be aware of or think that demonstrates or helps, I suppose, convince us that Jesus lived and died and rose again. So there's lots of evidence for that, if you like. It still can't be empirically proven. You can't demonstrate that that definitely happened the way you can demonstrate that the right combination of hydrogen and oxygen will create water. Again, there's evidence that can be marshalled for it. There are good reasons to believe that it's true, but it can't be proven in the kind of purest, highest scientific sense. Hence, the need for faith. Now, contrast that view that says, contrast that with the view that says that the only things that you can finally believe in are those things you can empirically prove via science. So if science can prove it, it's true. Otherwise, it's only a matter of feelings and subjective opinion. And that's where most of us place religion. But I'd argue the problem is you can't empirically prove the truth of that theory. It fails its own test. Even believing that our reason and our rationality are the ultimate grounds for truth relies on our reason and rationality, which, as someone else has pointed out, it's almost philosophically the equivalent of believing that all second-hand car salesmen are honest because second-hand car salesmen tell you that and they're honest. It's kind of circular in its reasoning. So get this. Holding up reason and empirical proof as being the supreme standard and guides of truth requires, I'd argue, having faith in them. It's a faith claim. It's an exercise of trust. That may sound like I'm raining on the parade of empirical proof, the scientific method and the place of reason, but I'm not. It's just recognising the limits of these methods as well as their strengths. And truth be told, so much of the things that we cherish in life, so many of the things that we presume are true, can't meet that high standard of empirical evidence. And we've talked about this before. I'm sure I've mentioned it before. I can't really prove, for example, that my wife, Louie, loves me. There's no way that I can validate that using the scientific method. But I live as if that's true. You can't really prove, again, if you really like your job. Again, there's no objective, final, scientific level standard of proof for that. There's evidence for it, but it can't be proven empirically. But we don't require that kind of empirical evidence to live like something is true. Nick Cave again, in his recent book, Love, Faith and Carnage, put it like this, and this was in relation to faith. Rational truth may not be the only game in town. I'm more inclined to accept the idea of poetic truth, or the idea that something can be true enough. To me, that's such a beautiful, humane expression. True enough. So much of the stuff in our life that we hold sacred and dear, again, we can't prove empirically, but it's true enough. And we live, we trust. Does it make sense? Okay. Even again, if we had to rely on things being empirically validated to be true, I'd still argue that's a faith claim. Saying that empirical evidence is the most important kind of evidence, how do you empirically prove that? Again, it fails its own test. So please be encouraged. Although it takes faith to believe in God, it also takes faith not to believe in God. And most of us live by faith one way or another in our important day-to-day relationships. So that's the first thing. Number 2 out of the 4. I'd argue that, Christian or not, most of us like the idea of being rugged individuals who seek pure, unadulterated truth on its own merits. But maybe, in reality, our conclusions, the conclusions that we reach about the big questions of life, are all influenced by a myriad of background factors that often get blurry and mixed up in the belief of whether we follow God or not, in the belief of God that we have or we don't have. So, for example, this is a pretty common stereotype that you'll hear, and there's a lot of truth to it. When you're young and you've grown up in a Christian home, there's a high chance that you'll identify with that Christian faith, because that's your family of origin. And that family of origin is a big background factor. And maybe you haven't yet made your own decision, okay? But maybe when you're a little older, maybe a young adult, you'll find more and more of your friends and social contacts may not believe. Isn't that also a big background factor? And there's a decent chance that you won't believe, or that you'll stop believing as well. But again, just like that first example, maybe you still haven't made your own independent decision. You see, you've just swapped out one powerful influence, your family of origin, with another, your current social group. In either case, it's got very little to do with the actual thing that you're believing or not believing. Or maybe you're a Christian, but you've also been incorrectly taught that people who don't believe what you believe are all immoral and unhappy people. But then you become friends with some really moral and happy non-Christian people. And suddenly that incorrect belief that you've associated with Christianity and faith, it's challenged. But you may lose your entire faith because that's been muddled up with Christianity. Or maybe you're a non-Christian, someone who doesn't believe yet, and you've swallowed the background factor that the amount of suffering in the world proves that a good God can't exist. You might not be aware that the problem of God and suffering is looked at by one of the largest books of the Bible, the book of Job. Suffering alongside a good God, this is hardly a new or novel challenge. People have been thinking about it and wrangling about it and dealing with it, if you like, managing it for thousands of years. Belief in God can actually accommodate suffering. So it's not so much the content of belief that's changed as much as our modern attitudes towards suffering and the right that we think we have to judge God as first world Westerners, because we know so much and we've come so far and we're so civilised, we can now sit in judgment on God. So the background factors and misconceptions can get mixed up and mistaken for the central core beliefs. And again, we can so easily, regardless of what we believe, we can so easily tell ourselves that, again, we've examined all the evidence and we have soberly made an objective, detached and independent decision as to whether we believe in God or not. But in reality, I don't think that's how most people work, myself included. Because we are such social creatures. We are so easily and understandably influenced by the people that we do life with. So, whether you decide to believe in God or not, please be aware of this. And as much as possible, make the decision, if you like, on its own merits. Don't go mixing up God with background factors such as morality or simple karma. And be aware of the background factor that at this stage, in our context, it's actually easier, I'd argue, it's actually more mainstream to not believe in God. So be encouraged. It's often hard to believe in God, not because believing in God is stupid or irrational or bad for you, but because many current background factors in our culture make it difficult and implausible. So that leads us to doubts. Number 3. I've had friends, maybe you have too, who have stopped believing in God because they doubted too much. I've had other friends who never really started believing in God because they felt they doubted too much to even begin with. And my suspicion is that doubting has a certain nobility about it. It's kind of cooler to doubt and be sceptical than to come across as some naive sucker. And doubting, it kind of keeps your options open. It's almost like a spiritual equivalent of dealing with FOMO, I guess. You can be non-committal in terms of what you believe. But here's the thing about doubting that Tim Keller pointed out in one of his books, such a good point. To doubt one thing is always dependent on believing another thing. So I can't doubt A unless I believe in B. So, for example, you may doubt that you're good at your job, but that's only because you believe that being good at your job means never getting negative feedback. You can doubt that your partner loves you because you believe that a loving partner would always laugh at your jokes and find you incredibly funny. You can doubt that God exists because you believe that if God exists, bad things wouldn't happen to good people, you see? You can doubt A only because you believe in B. But what if B is wrong? All this to say, we should question and even doubt our doubts. So be encouraged. Just because we have doubts about believing in God doesn't mean that we should just give up on the whole endeavour. Instead, drag those doubts into the light and examine the beliefs that are undergirding them. Does that make sense? It's okay to doubt your doubts. Just because you doubt something doesn't make it true. Okay, number 4, the last one. Morality and meaning. Believer or not a believer in the supernatural, we all need to land on a meaning of life and a framework for our morality. I can't see how we can escape or dodge that. All of us are faced with the questions eventually, like, what's the point of life? And how do I define or determine between what's good and what's bad, what's good and what's evil? These are questions that everyone is eventually confronted with if they live long enough. Now, if you don't believe in anything beyond the material, what we can detect and measure with our senses and our instruments, then this can be challenging. Because the big question is, where does morality come from? A Russian philosopher, Vladimir Solovyov, he rather cheekily, he wrote this: "Man descended from apes, therefore we must love another." Now you can see there's a gap there, right? There's a gap. The first sentence doesn't necessarily lead to the next. You see that? Man descended from apes, therefore we must love one another. So this is kind of absurd, but so many of us live like this is true. Lots of people would say, on the one hand, that they are materialists, that there's no divine, there's no God. What we see is all that there is. But on the other hand, they hold the values of liberal humanism. They're big fans of social justice, equality, human rights, etc. But it's hard to see how one leads to the other. Because you're going from the way things are, brute nature, we're all descended from apes, to the way things ought to be, should be, morality. You're going from an is to a should. And that's a big jump. That's a big leap. But if you believe and follow standard Christianity, then the social justice, the equality, the human rights is all baked in. Because we believe that human dignity is grounded in human beings being made in the very image of God and being loved by Him. We're instructed to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us, to turn the other cheek, to love our enemies even. We don't always get it right, we often get it wrong, but it's still part, if you like, of the package. So that's morality. Now, what about the meaning in life? Now, I hope this is obvious, but just in case. I don't think you have to believe in God in order to have meaning in life. You can devote yourself to a worthwhile cause. You can dedicate your life and your energy to something that is bigger than yourself. And I think that's admirable. In our current culture, some might say that when it comes to the ultimate meaning of life, it's the freedom to make your own meaning. Yeah? So the ultimate meaning of life is the freedom to make your own meaning. I think that's what a lot of people almost implicitly believe now. Individual freedom and autonomy is probably the most sacred value in our current climate. The freedom to determine when life starts, when life ends, things like gender, and a whole bunch of stuff in between is now a given. Now, there's no time to go into it now, but again, just notice that making freedom the number one value is a faith claim. Making individual freedom and autonomy the number one value is still a faith claim. There's no empirical evidence for that being true as far as I'm aware. And I'm a big fan of personal freedom and autonomy, by the way. I'm just pointing out, again, that you can't validate that using the scientific method. But perhaps the bigger issue with making our own meaning in life is, why does any of it matter? What's the ultimate point of it all if this life, this material life, is all that there is? The American philosopher Thomas Nagel, he wrote this: "Even if you produce a great work of literature which continues to be read thousands of years from now, eventually the solar system will cool, or the universe will wind down and collapse, and all trace of your effort will vanish. The problem is that although there are justifications for most things, big and small, that we do within life, none of these explanations explain the point of your life as a whole. It wouldn't matter if you had never existed. And after you've gone out of existence, it won't matter that you did exist." Happy Easter. Life's great. Enjoy your chocolate. Okay. But seriously, people who believe in God are often accused of living with their heads in the sand. Their religion is said to be an excuse not to have to think. You can get out of thinking by being religious. But maybe, in some cases, it's the opposite. If you don't believe in a God or anything beyond the material, then I can perfectly understand why you may not want to think much about the point of your life as a whole. I get why you'd want to avoid following the logic to its nihilistic end, and instead just focus on all the pleasant preoccupations that the good life here has to offer. Because an ultimately meaningless universe is bleak. But God reveals a stable and constant meaning to life, a point to existence and a hope that extends beyond death. So be encouraged. We all face the challenge of discerning morality and meaning from life. But believing in the Christian God provides both. And I'd say the kind of morality and meaning it brings resonates with us. It seems to intuitively make sense to so many people, almost as if we were designed for it. And if that's true, if those moral intuitions are true, then it's probably worth paying attention to. So there you have it. 4 factors that I think are common to all of us, regardless of whether we believe or not. Faith, an active trust, is a part of life. To believe in God takes faith. To not believe also requires it. It's not a case of the objective truth versus your subjective opinion. Second, background factors. None of us make big decisions independently from within some kind of vacuum. Whether we believe or we don't believe is partly influenced by things humming away in the background. We're influenced by other people, and often we're influenced by incorrect assumptions. Thirdly, doubts. Most of us have doubts. But doubts don't have to undo our beliefs. Our doubts are usually reliant upon some other truths. We can question and even doubt our doubts. And fourth, meaning and morality. We all need to find meaning in life and work out how to recognise right from wrong. But I'd suggest that God brings us meaning and morality. I don't think that we get enduring and durable meaning and morality from solely nature or what we see in our universe. So, to wrap this up, I know this talk has contained a lot of ideas. It's involved a lot of head stuff, I suppose. And again, I just want to stress that I think this is important, because again, if these questions aren't going through your mind, if you're not thinking about the stuff, that's completely okay. But I'd argue someone in your life, if you're a believer, is. And again, I'd argue that it's important because the general environment we find ourselves in, it's making belief more and more implausible. So it's good to remind ourselves that I think at least there is some plausibility in believing. But again, believing in the Christian God goes far beyond ideas and abstract truth. As they say, if you can argue someone into believing in God, they can presumably be argued out of believing in God. Yeah? So we believe fundamentally that Christianity isn't about abstract truth, but a lived relationship. So let me take you back to that reading we had at the start of the service. Jesus, again, fully God and fully human, the eternal Word made flesh, describes himself as the bread of heaven, or the bread of life, who gives life to the world. He describes himself as bread that nourishes as opposed to bread that perishes. He says that whoever eats this bread will never go hungry. And this isn't just true in a theoretical or head knowledge sense. This is true in a lived, fulfilled, satisfying sense. It's like what we read in Psalm 34. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste, experience. If you're a visitor here that is curious about believing in God, then I'd ask you, don't just learn about it, try it. If you're a regular here who is suffering a crisis of faith, or maybe feels that they're on the brink or on some particular fence, I'd encourage you, lean into Jesus more, read more about him, pray more to him, try to follow his way of living more, spend more time with us or some other faith community surrounded by people who, again, believe the same thing or want to go the same way. But always remember, always come back to the fact it's a relationship. And it's a relationship with, again, as we finish up our Easter Sunday service, with the God who loves us so much that he humbled himself. He stooped down, actually joined his creation. He died, as we heard, an unjust death, a death he didn't deserve in our place, and then rose again. And we believe that in rising again, he conquered death, he conquered evil, and he's bringing us into right relationship with God, our Creator, and each other. So we all have to believe in something at the end of the day. Even if you choose to believe in nothing, you're still making a choice to believe in something. So I'd encourage you, again, regardless of where you sit, ask, is there a better story than the one that you've heard about this morning? Is there a better story? You've got to believe in something. Is there a better story to believe? Is there a better story to take a chance on? Is this story so compelling that, again, even if you're not sure it's true, you'd like it to be true? And if you find yourself thinking, yeah, I wouldn't mind if that was true, then just try it. Take that small step of faith, of active trust. Try it, taste it, and see. Let me pray. Father, we thank you that you are the bread of life. We thank you that, again, while you use proof and human reason and rationality, and while you're the creator, the founder of science and technology, and all the different arts and skills that we have managed to amass as a species and as a civilization and culture, I thank you that although there's a place for that, you go beyond it. I thank you that you transcend it. I thank you that at the heart of the universe, at the heart of existence itself, there is a relationship. There is loving relationships, Father. And I thank you that you haven't left us alone. You haven't just created us and walked away, but you are actively pursuing us. And you're calling us to have life and life to the full. And I thank you for, again, your Spirit and your Son. And that today of all days, we can reflect on the fact that you have conquered death. You've overcome evil. You have suffered in our place out of love for your creation. And I pray that we will be motivated and inspired by that to follow you, to lean into you, and to love you more. Amen.